So without further ado, I want to introduce Laura Ingalls. As I mentioned, she is related to Laura Ingalls Wilder, and therefore she is a born storyteller. She comes from a long tradition of storytelling, so she has a ton of great information to share with you today. Laura, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I was just talking to someone who came to this workshop last week. You guys got in just under the wire to learn about storytelling, which you said was really a great workshop. And you had to take a little bit on faith to come to the workshop because I know your inboxes are full of offers and things like that. So I'm glad you're here. This is going to be super practical today. And the more that you participate in the chat, the more I can customize the information to your needs. So let's get underway. As Brianna mentioned, Brianna and I have a small women-run business called They Have Solutions, and we help nonprofits like yours get donor mail done. And we have a real focus on donor mail. We do some other donor communications, but donor mail is something that can be really difficult for nonprofits to get done, but it's really a high return tactic. So we help people with the data, the writing, and then getting the production done for that. And Brianna and I come from the nonprofit world. We met at a national animal welfare charity where Brianna actually did training for 2,000 animal welfare partners. I think we've got Animal Foundation in the house today. So that's where we met, doing training and doing storytelling for animal welfare. You'll see a little of that reflected in our materials today, but I also have a background in human rights, international development. I was just talking a little bit with Benjamin about that, but we just realized that there was a lot that we could do to help nonprofits be more effective and make donor communications easy for you. So that's a little bit about what our company does. Today, our context for our discussion really is going to be your year-end fundraising, because that is when, 31% of all revenue comes in for nonprofits on average. For some nonprofits, it's half of your revenue. And this has been a funny year, but time is starting to run out on doing that year-end fundraising. You'll see it's 4 to 6 weeks to get your fall campaign done. I'm starting to write those this week. Thanksgiving, you'll need your appeal for Thanksgiving to drop before Thanksgiving. That's about 3 months away. Sounds like a little, but in COVID days, it's probably even less. And then holiday, of course, is you want that appeal to drop right around Thanksgiving, end of November. And that's about 16 weeks away. So time is moving. So as I mentioned, this is part of a 3-part webinar series. We've already done data. And if you missed that, data is so important because the worst thing you can do is tell a wonderful story and it doesn't actually get to someone's inbox or their mailbox. Or what I think is even worse, you spend money on that appeal and then their name, you misspell the donor's name, or you don't ask them for enough money. You're not personalizing your ask. Well, Brianna did a great webinar about donor data, and we've got a recording of that, and you'll find that in our blog. And then starting next week, we'll kick off a 2-week series about avoiding costly donor mail traps so that you can save as much time as you need and save as much money as you need on doing really effective year-end mailings. So that's what's behind us and what's ahead. So once upon a time, people told stories around campfires, and they came from lands far and wide to do that. And of course, they shared news. They talked about the price of saffron in Samarkand. They talked about what roads were now beset by bandits and you don't want to go there. But as the embers started dying down through the night, every person knew that it was going to be their time to tell their story, to represent their culture, because every culture had a rich storytelling tradition. And it really communicated to people around you how you shared things in common with each other, even though you might be from, vastly different continents. So that was something that we shared, and it was a human quality that we shared around that campfire on those spice runs and those spice paths. Today, storytelling, not so much. We're great content consumers, and by the glow of our tablets and our computers and our smartphones, we take in a lot of content, but very few of us are telling complete and active stories. So I think this is really, starting to become a lost art. And there are nonprofits that are actually promoting storytelling that would agree with me. If you doubt that storytelling is dying, or at least a little bit in danger, all you need to do is look at Hollywood and see the lack of original storytelling. How many Batmans can I live through in one lifetime? So today, I'm so glad you're here, because you're going to learn the secrets of storytelling and be able to pass those on to your donors, to really engage them and help them invest in your mission. So first of all, let's look at what storytelling is. The National Storytelling Network is a nonprofit that is dedicated to keeping storytelling alive. And they say storytelling is really about 5 components of storytelling. The first one is that storytelling is inherently interactive. Storytelling should be a two-way conversation that provokes a response in the person who is reading it, or the person who is taking that in. And if you've ever seen a traditional storyteller, the Arab world has a huge, they have a name for people who are storytellers called Hakawati. And he sits on this kind of throne in the coffee house, and he tells these rousing stories about history. And it really is a two-way conversation with the audience. And it's really fun, really very performance art. The next thing that we know about storytelling is that it involves language. Storytelling involves words, big revelation, right? But it involves using the right words. And as we'll talk about a little today, those are not the words that you learned in college. It's the kind of words that you would use to talk to your mother about what you do at the Thanksgiving table or at the holiday table. So storytelling 3 is about actions. Now, when you're standing up in front of someone, you can rap a cane on the table, or you can get people clapping. You can get some movement with your hands that really tell people something. But it's a little bit harder in a written piece to show action. And I want you to think about this as parts of the story that are not words, parts that say something about your credibility, pictures that you use that tell people something about the people you serve. And maybe those people are just like them. And those are the non-verbal or the non-word parts of your appeal. Fourth, it needs to tell a complete story, a narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what I often find with nonprofit stories is we tell part of the beginning, we kind of skip over the middle, and then we get to the end. And so we're going to talk about how to tell that complete story today. And then finally, it draws in the reader. It draws in the person who's telling their story, and it invites them to see themselves in the story, to imagine this happening to them. And what would they do? And you really need to get to that imagination level when you tell stories in your fundraising appeals. So that's storytelling. So we'll just cut to the chase. There are 5 secrets that we're going to be talking about today. 1, stories are usually better than facts. That's very different than what you learned in school, and we'll talk about that. Fundraising stories, a complete story, should contain 7 basic elements. Story choice is a critical factor. Sometimes in the nonprofits I've worked in, we get really close to having to get that fundraising appeal out. We're at that appeal time right now for fall letters. So we've got to choose our stories this week. And we kind of choose whatever's close, whatever we can get our hands on. And that's the story that we end up using. But we'll talk about what are some of the factors that you want to balance in choosing the best story for the most profitable time of the year for your nonprofit. Number 4, your English teacher didn't prepare you to write appeals. And I come from a journalism background. I worked as a producer and writer for CNN back in the early days when CNN was really good at storytelling. And I can tell you that your journalism professor didn't teach you how to write fundraising appeals either. So it's okay. We're all starting from the same place. And then finally, the old writer's adage, complexity kills. And we'll see how complexity can kill fundraising writing, and how finding really simple, smart ways to phrase things can really make your writing soar. And writing come alive. So let's start with that first one. Stories are usually perform better than factual arguments. And this is interesting because in the West, we learn to give factual arguments. I was having a conversation the other day with an accountant and a lawyer. They're nonprofit specialists, but they work within accounting and law. And they were talking all about the exciting tax benefits this year because of COVID-19, because of the CARES Act. There have been additional tax deductions that have been put forth for U.S. donors. And so they were saying, wow, you're going to have to explain all of these amazing tax benefits that people are going to be able to get. And that's really what these fundraising appeals should be about. And I told them, whoa. No, facts actually have a very different psychological effect on people's brains. And we know that from psychological study after psychological study. I've cited one here at the bottom of the slide. And these researchers found out that when we take stories in, we radically change the way the information is processed. We open our minds and we see that story as more true than if someone would come at us with a factual argument. It's kind of like we all know the story about the Trojan horse. They wheel in this Trojan horse, but inside there are soldiers. Inside for a fundraising appeal is the money that you're going to ask for. That's the ask. But it's that beautiful Trojan horse, that gift that you give them, that's the story. And that's how you get it past the guards and get it past the gate. And we know that when readers are really absorbed in a story, that they detect fewer false starts. When people come at you with a factual argument, if you've been on social media lately, especially in the United States, and I know in Nigeria too, there's lots of politics. And you just get so tired of listening to, everyone trying to make their factual argument. But when you see that story, you let down your guard a little bit, and you'll actually read that and say, well, maybe that's actually true. And that's the effect that telling stories has on people versus facts. So here's what the accountant and the lawyer, who I love deeply, and they have helped so many nonprofits in these challenging times, here's how they would write an appeal. And I'm going to read some of these things to you. Thanks to the CARES Act, there is a new charitable tax deduction. If you take the standard deduction, don't itemize, on your 2020 tax return, you can claim up to $300 for cash donations to believe in the future you make this year. And taxpayers who are at least 65 years old or blind can claim an additional tax deduction of $1,300. Are you guys still listening? Probably not. Not very interesting. 1,006. Did you fall asleep? Yeah. This is the kind of appeal that they would have you write. $1,650 if using the single or head of household filing status. And in here in Arizona, we don't just have tax deductions, we also have a dollar for dollar tax credit up to $800. That's pretty snoozy for an appeal. So let's contrast that with how an appeal should be written, or how it should start out. Here's a story-led appeal. What would you choose? Stay in an abusive relationship until you can scrape together a month's rent? Or suddenly become homeless with a toddler and a 10-year-old? It took a lot of courage for Rhea to make that choice this past summer, but it plunged her family into what seemed like an even more hopeless situation. She had no job and nowhere to live. That is, until you, the donor, offered Rhea a helping hand up from poverty. Can you see the difference? Really very different kinds of stories. And we will share it in the chat, but I actually wrote some story-led appeals that were based in Nigeria, and I'll make sure that Benjamin receives those, because there's amazing stories all over the world that we want to tell versus telling something that's really quite bureaucratic and fact-based. Our brains take that information in differently. That said, could you answer in the chat, can you think of a time in the calendar, the fundraising calendar, the nonprofit calendar, when you might want to lead with facts over stories? Pop quiz. What is the time of year in which, and it's a very short time of year, in which facts might do better than a story? Give me your ideas. Tax time? Yep, I think that's a possibility. End of year. Yep, Brianne nails it. Specifically, the last 3 days of the year. People make decisions based on emotion for 362 days of the year, or 361 if we talk about tax day. But those last 3 days of the year, those people are making logical decisions. They're not making emotional decisions. So those last 3 days of the year, that's when you want to remind people that they should get their tax deduction in. So by the end of the year. Very good. Very good. So let's move on to our second secret, that fundraising stories contain 7 basic elements. Now, down in the materials, you'll see our storytelling treasure map. That actually is a nice infographic that you can print out, and that will actually show you the steps one by one. And as I mentioned, a lot of people don't fully talk about the character to make people really invest and imagine themselves in it. They skip over the middle, and then they get to the end. So here are those 7 basic elements. 1, you have to start with a character. One character. People have a very hard time with multiple characters, and it's a lot harder for you to write a story with multiple characters. So I really suggest in your appeals that you have only one story and it have one main focused person that people can emotionally invest in. You need to know something about that person. You need to have an investment in who they are as a person, but those details need to be sparing. You need to have very good reasons for choosing those 2 or 3 essential details. And we'll look at a couple of great examples of what those details were. So you really are just sort of panning gold, looking for those 2 or 3 important details that make people sympathetic and care about it. Your character needs to have a personal goal. Their personal goal isn't just to get services or become educated by your organization. They have a larger life goal. And I bet it parallels life goals that some of your donors have as well. So really ask yourself, what is their personal goal? What are they trying to achieve in life? There's got to be a villain, and I think you need to name the villain. As a nonprofit person, you are very well aware of what the problem is and the scope of the problem, what is actually the issue, but it's not so clear to your donors. So you have to name that villain. Don't keep it vague. There needs to be conflict. And this isn't like I'm the younger sister in my family. So this isn't like, beating up on my older brother. It's not conflict in that way. It really is the points of emotional tension in the story. This is the middle. It's very rare that people wave their magic wand and a problem goes away. Often we strive to do better, and it's 1 step forward and 2 steps, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There's often some setbacks that people experience along the way, and people want to know about that because it makes your story more real. Change, there needs to be change in every story. That 180-degree change, that their life is better, if it really is 180 degrees. And that change needs to be transformational, not transactional. Sometimes I see it is, we delivered a service, all better. That's not what it needs to be. It needs to be something that's really enabled them to do better in their life and seek that greater good. And then you can need to connect that story to the larger narrative. If you've done a focus story about one person, they're representative of probably tens of thousands of people in similar situations that you serve. So that helps you transition out of the story and into talking about the problem and then why your solution is credible. So you need to make sure that you have that zoom in, but then you're able to get out of that and look at that larger narrative. And today, Sandy Reese, if she's a great fundraiser, if you follow her, she has a blog about storytelling, and she talks about using your core number. That's the amount that it takes you to serve 1 unit of service or help 1 person. You need to have a handle on that number, and that number is actually a great way to get out of your story and into the larger narrative or the larger problem. So 7 elements. So let's do a little workshopping here. Are you all familiar with Harry Potter? I'm using this example because Harry Potter is a rebirth story. The most famous rebirth story is Jesus, where something catastrophic happens and then he is reborn. And then you see that same story in Harry Potter, right? And many of the stories that you will write at nonprofits are transformational. They're about people's lives being reborn, something happening new in their lives. So let's talk about that. We all know who Harry Potter is. what are the absolute essential details you need to know about Harry Potter to understand what happens in those really long books? They get longer as they go on, right? What are the essential details you need to know about Harry Potter? Put those in the chat. We know a lot about him. He likes jelly beans. He has lots of magic cloaks and whatnot. But what is the important things we need to know? He's English. That's not so important. He was an abused child. He's an orphan, right? He's an orphan. And how did he get orphaned? How did Harry Potter get orphaned? His parents were killed by Voldemort, he who shall not be named. But he didn't die, yes. Those are essential things that you need to know about Harry Potter. And he's magical. He's magical. He's an orphan in an abusive situation. His parents were killed. He was not killed in the same attack. He lived for some reason. The boy who lived. Those are the essential things you need to know about him. You don't need to know his jelly bean preference. The, what is it? Bert's magic jelly beans.
Bots,
You don't need
every flavor bean.
Bots. You don't need to know that. But essential details. But those things make him real as a character. We already mentioned the villain, Voldemort. And there's a lot of conflict that goes on, right? They have lots of fights, and Harry Potter has difficulties in school with his professors. There's lots of things that go on. He's kind of got a father figure. But what is the larger narrative? Let's talk about the larger narrative. And in the end, they protect the school, and everyone lives happily ever after. That's kind of the change that happens, and Voldemort is vanquished. But what is the larger, really very adult narrative of Harry Potter? Does anyone remember that? What's the larger reason that Voldemort is trying to defeating evil? Yeah. Yeah, Voldemort believes that only magical people should live, and muggles like us should not live. So it's this very adult kind of thing that there are certain types of people who are better than others. And so it's kind of a larger narrative about race and class and all of these kinds of things. So it's very, very sort of serious, but that's the larger narrative. If you would look at the Harry Potter as a focus story, and then how do you transition? So lots of magical boys or muggle girls, those muggle girls like Hermione who want to be magical. So that's the 7 elements in Harry Potter. So let me ask you this. I'm going to read you a story, and you tell me yes or no in the chat. Is it a complete story? Here we go. Luis and his wife, both non-citizens, came to the office to request assistance with Medicaid benefits for their son, who is a citizen. They were hesitant to apply due to the Public Charge Act, a rule that specifies aliens must be able to care for themselves. They were concerned that applying would affect the process of legal citizenship for them. Our benefits counselor explained the rule, making them feel more comfortable to apply. Yes or no, is it a complete story? What do you think? Does it inspire you to give money? What happened to them? All right, there's some missing information. So we know there's a lot of characters. There's Luis, there's his unnamed wife, and their son. We don't have a lot of essential details. All we know is that their son is a citizen and they're not citizens. We don't know why they're seeking medical benefits for their son. Maybe he has a condition. Maybe he has diabetes, or maybe he has, a heart condition that we would like to know about. That might be an essential detail why they need that medical care for their son. We don't know a lot about their personal goal. We know that they want to become citizens, but we don't know, did they flee oppression at home, and that's why they're here? Were they involved in a very difficult poverty situation and they needed to seek that kind of assistance? The villain isn't really named. Is the villain the law? Is the villain poverty? Is the villain immigration? We don't really know who the villain is. Conflict, we don't hear too much about it. All we know is that they applied. We don't know what change happened as a result of them being able to have medical care. That can be very transformational. And then what is that larger narrative of, people who are working here and need medical care? That's best for society. So that's not a complete story. Is this one a complete story? This one was written by a dear executive director friend of mine, and she had to write it at the last minute. So let's look a little bit at this story. Charlie is disabled by a brain injury and lives alone in a one-bedroom apartment with his cats, who he says are his heart and his family. His caseworker searched unsuccessfully for months for an affordable spay-neuter option because Charlie's cats were reproducing, and the number of cats in his home was becoming more than he could care for. We were able to sterilize all of Charlie's cats at no cost, helping him to keep his beloved cats and stay in his home. Your support helps us sterilize thousands of pets like Charlie's each year. Is that a complete story, yes or no? Yes. Certainly better, isn't it? It's almost a complete story, Marie. We're not exactly sure what his personal goal is, and we're not exactly sure what the villain is. It's not expressly laid out, because sometimes it's challenging for us to say, it's the landlord. The landlord is the villain in this particular story. It also could be, disability or poverty, but it really is, he's struggling in life as we all have times in which we're struggling, but the point of tension is really that villain, right? So it's pretty close. To keep his cats, that's a goal, and the villain was poverty. Could be, but it's not really well put out there, right? But it's certainly a better story. It's certainly a better story. So let's look at how it could be written. So Charlie calls his cats his heart and his family. Their antics bring him comfort as he copes with a life of pain in his cramped flat in Ottawa. You see, Charlie lives with a brain injury. It keeps him from working and doing so many things that you and I tend to take for granted. Charlie's caseworker had looked for months to find an affordable spay-neuter clinic. The cats were multiplying, and Charlie's landlord was threatening eviction. But you helped us alter Charlie's cats at no cost to him. That meant he could keep his family and stay in his home. Thanks to you, we help thousands of pets and people in need each year. So let's compare those two. See, it's a little bit more complete, right? Right, much better. So good. So let's see why. So this is a complete story. Charlie, he's got a brain injury. It expressly says he can't work. We assumed that before. And we know where he lives. He lives in Ottawa because people care about helping causes close to them when they can. His personal goal, yes, to keep his pet home and his pets. The villain is the landlord. You might also notice, let's see, in addition to being more complete, this is also better because it brings the donor in. Yes, it makes the donor the hero of the story. You're looking ahead. All right. So let's take a look at that. So do you have readability statistics installed in your Word? If you're using Word as a program, there's actually a built-in function that allows you to run it through what was a military program for coming up with the most readable directions. You want folks in the military to be able to read the directions on the things that they're doing. And so they came up with the Fleisch-Kincaid system, and it's built into Word to tell you how readable is what I'm writing. It's a very basic thing that you can do. I actually found out about this really late in my writing life, and it's really been quite transformational for my own writing. So a couple things you'll notice in comparison to the first version is on the left, the second version is on the right. The one on the left uses twice as many words per sentence. Those were long sentences. I think I needed water in between some of the sentences. And on the right, those are much shorter sentences, easier for the reader to get through. On the left, half of this is written in passive voice. That's the difference between the action has happened to the subject or the subject had an action, made an action happen. That's kind of the difference. So a passive sentence on the left, you don't want passive sentences. They're very indirect. You want direct sentences. So 0 is what you want for passive sentences. You'll see in terms of reading ease, 60% versus 82%, almost 83%. That's a big difference. That's on a scale of 100. The closer you can get to 100, the easiest it is for people to read it, particularly on a mobile phone, for example. It isn't just people's reading ability, but also the format in which they're reading it. And then this is the big kicker, the grade level. The grade level of the first one is kind of sophomore, junior level in high school level, where the one on the right is just under 5th grade. And this is important. Doesn't it sound condescending? It doesn't. It removes jargon. So let's talk about why it matters and whether it's condescending or not. I hear that quite often. So only 12% of Americans read at the 10th grade level. This is according to a study that's done every 10 years in every country in the world. It's called the PIAA, and it looks at global literacy. Only 12% of Americans read at a 10th grade level, whereas 82% of Americans read at a 4th grade level. Reading ease is measured by this large algorithm within the Fleisch-Kincaid. It does have a Wikipedia entry, so you can definitely read all about what goes into that reading ease. I can tell you in terms of when I think about how can I increase reading ease and reduce the grade level, the first thing I look at is jargon. How can I get rid of words like sterilization and use fix or alter, or, how can I use words that are much, much shorter? In the nonprofit world, particularly my background, which is international development, we love to use words like facilitate, implement, capacitate. Those all drag your reading. Those all make it harder for people to actually read what you're writing, that kind of jargon. So. And I don't think if you really compare those two examples, that the second one sounded simplistic, right? It was actually pretty easy to read, and we weren't talking down to people. We were just making it easier for them to get through it by shortening the sentence length. You don't want to have any more than 2 sentences per paragraph if you can manage it. And if you find yourself doing lots of explaining, you want to stick a period on something and start a new thought. I always do 1 thought per sentence. I don't try to cram a lot of things in there. So contractions. I love contractions. I think it depends a little bit on your brand, but I think contractions are how we speak conversationally. And as you remember, this storytelling should be a 2-way conversation that provokes a response. You don't tell people that you're intelligent or that you know your stuff by using words that they can't really understand. They won't, or they can't read. So, and I actually have a nice blog that has a list of some of those things that people that we use all the time in the nonprofit world internally, but externally, it just sinks your fundraising appeal. So, and there are more questions that I haven't seen here. I'm sure Brianna will prompt me. Or
I'm watching, but I think it's important to really emphasize that your donation request letters are not a business letter. They're not a bill. They're not a formal grant request. Think of them as a letter to a friend. And how would you write to your friend? And then, ask them to be the hero in this story. And of course, you might use contractions with your friend, or if these are your elders and you have a very formal relationship, it's all about what does the donor want to hear from you.
Absolutely. Another thing we know is that when we use first person pronouns like I, our, we, it drags down readability. And when we use pronouns like you and your, it increases readability. There's been studies that date back to 1934 that say first-person pronouns, our programs, we survived COVID, makes readability, makes it hard for people to read. People are more engaged when they're the hero of the story. When you, the donor, made this happen, you changed Charlie's life. Your generosity makes a difference for people just like Charlie. Those kinds of things maybe sound funny when we write them, but donors love it and it makes it more readable. Lots of studies about that. So secret number 3 is story choice. Story choice is a critical factor, and it's not something that should be left until the last minute. It requires you to think very thoughtfully about who is your donor. If you were part of Brianna's donor data session, or if you'll spend some time looking at the transcript and the video on our blog, it'll really help you dig into your data to find out who is your donor, what do we think their daily life looks like. There's a very big difference between someone who is my age, who is sandwiched between children and their aging parents and worrying about both, and versus somebody who is retired and they're looking forward to, engaging in some of the hobbies that they love, but they also have grandchildren that they're looking for. Those people, your story meets those people at different points in their life journey. And knowing who your donor is, often here in the United States, our donors are right about 62-year-old women. So, what is something that's going to appeal to them and make them start having those internal conversations? How does it relate to their life? We just did a story for the Arizona Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired. And I had maybe 10 stories to choose from. And we ended up telling a story about April. And April was someone who started working when she was 15 years old. And she is a dedicated mother. She is a dedicated grandmother, just like some of the donors. And she has a sick husband who she's trying to take care of. And she's only 40 years old. And she's things are starting to be a little blurry in her vision, but she ignores it because she has so much going on in her life that she's got to take care of. And she'll get to her own needs later. And by the time that she finally gets to going to the optometrist, he tells her that she's legally blind and will have to turn over her driver's license. So there's a couple really interesting details in there. One, turning over your driver's license as you get older, that's something that an older donor might worry about. And then the shock that this was happening to someone who's 40 years old. We know people who are older in advertising like to think of themselves as a little bit younger. So they might actually see April, that story, as a peer. But we just think that's really going to be a great story that performs for them for their acquisition appeal. So, which gets me to asking yourself, what kind of appeal is this? Is it retention? Most of your year-end appeals will be talking to people you know. They already love you and they love what you do. And you're just reminding them of the change that they make happen through your organization. It's not what you're doing, it's what they're doing. And so it really should be a story that ends in a happy place, because donors who give you money want to know that you've done something positive, done something happy. We all need those stories. We're hungry for those stories this year because we're surrounded by so much sadness. So that's a retention story. An acquisition story tends to be a little more negative. If you think about those ASPCA commercials, they don't end in a happy place. The happy place is if you give them $19 a month. So acquisition stories tend to be a little bit more sad. And that's just the science of how that storytelling works. You got to ask yourself, what are we trying to do? And then what is that ask going to be? Are you asking people to give a one-time gift? That's often what we're doing at the end of the year. Make your annual gift, your big annual gift. Here for the fall fundraiser or the fall appeals, we're having a lot of people use their fall appeal to ask people to join their monthly giving list. Start giving a little amount every year to help sustain us through difficult times like we're seeing with COVID-19. We're also seeing people use their fall appeal for planned giving. So they'll take a segment of their appeal and look at people who in their donor base they know are likely to be planned givers. And that's often people who've given for at least 5 years are good planned givers, and people who are starting to do that planning on behalf of their family. Then there's actually looking at your story type. So there's some research that says child stories do better than adult stories. People respond better to them. Women, stories about women, we're more sympathetic to women than we tend to be to men. And if you work in the animal welfare space, people generally like to see stories about dogs over cats. Of course, there are exceptions. If you're building a cat wing, a cat nursery, or you're doing a trap, neuter, and return program, which is specifically cats, there is a segment of your population that is wild about helping cats. And they are the under cats, as it were. Every donor who loves cats knows that. And so being able to have that ability in your database to know what people actually respond to is really helpful. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't write stories about adults. I know we have some folks that are with assisted living facilities on today, hospice. That doesn't mean that you can't write about some of those older people because they have amazing stories. But you just have to be aware. You may be able to tell their story through a child, a daughter who has to make a heart-wrenching decision in her life and how that ends up making her father's life better. For example, you could tell that story in that way, and that might make it more accessible to a wider number of people. But I don't think you should shy away from telling unpopular stories if you start getting really comfortable with storytelling. And we'll take a look at a little bit of that. So let me read this appeal to you. And tell me in the chat why you think it worked. Where would you go if your spouse suddenly died? Then, just as you were healing from that loss, you found yourself alone in your doctor's office, and you heard him say that cruel word, cancer. Aisha, 67, turned to her daughter. After all, Aisha was an Army veteran, and she'd find a way to come back stronger. She just needed a little time. But when her daughter's boyfriend threw her out just days before Christmas last year, Aisha lost more than just a warm place to sleep. She lost her hope. Thanks to you, Aisha found a safe haven at St. Brianna's shelter. We told this story this spring in the middle of COVID-19. What is it about this story that resonates with you? Tell me in the chat. Yep, Marie, we can all get overwhelmed and lose hope, right? Can you imagine you lose your spouse, then cancer, then, the people you depend on the most, you end up being turned out at Christmas. It's a lot there. And it's relatable, right? This could happen to anyone else. They say a lot of people are just a paycheck away from being homeless. So, cool word, cancer, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's feeling physical peril. She has cancer in the middle of COVID. She has emotional peril that she suffered that wasn't her fault. And then this other situation. Ah, yes. Story selection, Marie, you're right. She's an Army veteran, right? In journalism school, they taught us not to be hoodwinked or fooled by age, because we have a tendency to be sympathetic toward age. We have a tendency to be sympathetic toward women, veterans, people in authority. That's something we learned in journalism school. But as a fundraiser, if there's a detail like that to pull out, and that detail was not in the original story that the organization gave me, but I started poking around a little bit to find what is that sympathetic piece. We wrote a story this spring, and I don't know if it was essential detail, but I wanted to talk about a child. We were talking about a child, and I wanted to paint a picture of that child, a nice visual picture. And so the child liked chocolate cookies and had chocolate cookies all over her face. So, but that she's a veteran, I think that's a sympathetic thing that we want to pull out of there. So that's why that appeal worked. How about this one? Sometimes we have people that we serve, our beneficiaries who aren't very sympathetic. They've done something in life that was not the norm, and society would normally judge them for that. This story is about someone who was a drug abuser. And we debated, should we actually do a story about someone who's on drugs? But it was such a great story that we decided to tell it. So here we go. Showing up. That simple act can mean so much to a person who is hurting. A person like John, who today dedicates his life to helping people recover from drug addiction at a transitional housing program that St. Brianna Food Bank serves. But just a few years ago, it was John who needed help. He spent years struggling with addiction, And he knew that if he didn't get help soon, he wouldn't be around much longer. John made the brave decision to change his life. What is it about this appeal that makes you sympathetic or makes you think positively about someone who has been a drug abuser for many years? We have a lot of internal conversations at nonprofits about how do we write about people who aren't just children and dogs. How do we write people who maybe we serve and we care about, but they're not necessarily, we don't, on the surface, they're not sympathetic. How did we humanize John? How did we make John someone that the donor wants to cheer for? Just do it, John, you're amazing. He changed his life, right? He made a decision on his own. And the story goes on to say that he put all of his belongings in a shopping cart and pushed it down to the transitional living facility. So he took some action on his own. John showed up. And if you've ever known anyone with a drug addiction, when you're their family member, you don't want to show up for them because they just keep over and over the same drama kind of pulls out. And at some point, you've got to distance yourself from people. So that idea of showing up, here's a human being, and maybe his people showed up for him at first, but his drug addiction went on. But you know something? The donor showed up just at his greatest moment of need. So I'm teary even reading this story. So yeah, and he's giving back. Brianna loves the give back story. Anytime that we can find that angle, I know that she's crying on the other side of the screen, right, Brianna?
Yes, yeah, I'm thinking about this story, and that's one of the tests that Laura, especially uses when we're communicating about, I found that nugget because now I'm finally tearing up, right? Your letter should evoke your feelings. If it doesn't evoke something in you, it's unlikely to evoke something in the donor. So you want to create that warm fuzziness that really touches the donor's heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And Brianne makes a smart observation that we led with who he is now, the person that we wanted him to be, that his family probably wanted him to be. And then there's this little, then there's this little surprise. We didn't write for paragraph and paragraph and paragraph about him, but what you know about him is this is about rebirth. This is about a comeback kid. And not only did he come back for himself, he's coming back for other men just like him. So there are now thousands of people like John all over his city because you, the donor, made sure that there was food for him in his recovery center. It's just an amazing story. So you can write about people who don't necessarily seem like the most sympathetic, but you've got to think about what is the story about. Before I sit down and write a client story, I think about what is the one emotion that this story is about. What is the one point of tension that would happen in this person's life? And people with drug addiction, they're abandoned by their own people because it's just so frustrating to deal with someone with addiction. Even though you love them, at some point you've got to bless and release. But that donor didn't bless and release, and they were there in a way that maybe his family couldn't be. So that was kind of the tension there. But I really sit and think about it, and if I start bawling, I know I've got an absolute winner. So, and John's story was one of his winners. So. The interesting thing about this story as well, just as an aside, this isn't about the transitional housing program. This is about a food bank that made sure the housing center or the housing program had food. Some of you have programs that have affiliates that actually do the work. And then how do you tell that story? This is an example of that kind of story. So how do you write about a story that's not human? How do you write about trees? Do you have any ideas? This spring, we have a client that is working to restore an urban forest. and they were saying, can we actually do a story during COVID-19? Number one, is it ethical to do a story when so many essential causes need money? They decided it was. They do not have a scarcity mindset. There is not a dearth of money out there. People give to what they are passionate about and what they love. So how do you write about trees, particularly during COVID, and make people pay attention? Any thoughts? This is one of the rare stories I've written this year that is not about hope. It is about rebirth because it's helping a forest become more healthy, but it's not about hope. It's not about love. Imagine a world without trees. Yeah. What is it about trees that provokes emotions in us? What emotions do trees evoke for us? Trees are hopeful. Yeah. So let's take a look. And what do trees mean? So I thought about what is the donor's experience with trees. This happens to be, a beautiful, one of those beautiful little mountain towns that has had a lot of deforestation. Yep, trees are about peace. Trees are about wonder. I decided trees were about magic, and I'll tell you about that. But the donor's experience of looking up in those trees and just being surrounded by nature, right? It's so peaceful. It's so restful, restorative even. And that's how they feel about trees. So I thought about, what's the experience what is our first experience with trees? And so this is what I read about. As a kid, did you have a favorite tree? Maybe you climbed to its highest branches or built a rickety treehouse in it with your friends. Maybe you read an amazing book in its cool shade. One thing was certain. Every time you visited that tree, it was like magic. That's how 6-year-old Daisy feels about her favorite tree. Her red maple is one of the 500 trees that you helped us give away this year to restore Winnipeg's urban forest. But you didn't stop there. Thanks to you, Daisy learned to properly transport, plant, and care for her tree so that it grows up big and strong beside her. So that's the tree. I thought about, as a kid, I had a favorite tree, and they had a child who, funny enough, had a plant name as her first name, and she is one of the kids who got one of these trees that are restoring the urban forest. And it's an adorable picture of her with her arms around her first tree. And the nice thing is when she gets to be my age, that tree's going to be bigger, and maybe her own kids will be under the shade of that tree. So it is a love story, but it's a love story between a girl and her tree. And it really is just about the magic we feel as children, or that peace we feel with trees. So that's how we wrote that one in the middle of COVID, and it did quite well. It exceeded the goal for this organization. So the secret number 4, your English teacher didn't prepare you to write appeals. In school, we're taught to write a logical, factual argument, if you remember. And we write essays, the 5-paragraph essay. And in that we basically use lots of logic, very little emotion, and lots of credibility in terms of sources and the grammar that we use and the important words that I learned to use when I got my master's degree. And that is how we do things, but it really is making a factual argument. And this is what the structure looks like. We use an introduction. There might be a little emotion, but the introduction is really about making our main point. This is my thesis, and I'm going to prove it with 3 paragraphs that are proof points that look at different details, facts, figures, and sources that are credible. And I'm going to prove this to you. And the conclusion is, I proved it to you. So I'm going to prove something to you. I'm proving something to you. I just proved something to you. Very little room for emotion. And it's very different from what we do in a fundraising appeal. And I often find when people write fundraising appeals, they try to use an essay structure instead of a fundraising appeal structure. So you can see an example of how the Charlie story was originally displayed there's a handout called Epic Storytelling. And the front page is lots of essay. And the story is buried on the back page. So take a look at that and you can see the essay structure doesn't work as well as flipping that around. So let's see what that looks like from a fundraising perspective. There are different ways to write fundraising stories, but I often find this is the structure that I'm using. So I start with an emotional story, and I look for the moment with the greatest emotion. So what is that moment of tension? What is that moment of hope? You think back to the Aisha story, lost her spouse, had cancer. That should be enough for any woman to go through, right? And now she's alone. And then I thank the donor for everything that they've done. I resolve the story. I show a little bit of the conflict of the story, and I talk about the middle. And then I resolve it. And then I make a soft ask of the donor. So the first donor thank you is, but thanks to you, Aisha got the help she needed. So, it's going to be okay. Keep reading the story. The soft ask might be, because of you, women like Aisha have a place to go. The next thing I do is I relate the story that I've just told you to the larger problem. And I explain why the organization has a credible solution to that problem. So Aisha is one of thousands of women, particularly women of color, who are facing homelessness right now. And I talk about how the shelter is helping those women. Those women have been able to stay in a local hotel where they are safe and they're able to practice social distancing better. This organization works with they partner with other organizations in the area. So Aisha was able to take advantage of a veterans program that helped her get rent assistance so she could get into her own apartment because she had bladder cancer and she needed, to have her own place. At that point, I make a harder ask. I start asking, will you make a critical gift today for people like Aisha? Fourth part, I make a logical appeal. This is where I start talking about what is it going to cost. So I've done emotion, credibility, so lots of emotion, a section of credibility about who your organization is, what is the scope of the problem, why is what you're doing make sense in the local context, why is it good for your community? So that's the ethos or the credibility part. And then I finally get to the logic part. I get to the accountant part about I'm asking you to make a one-time gift of this amount, which is going to achieve this. You're going to be able to achieve this with this donation. Or I'm asking you to give a monthly gift to not only solve these short-term problems, but make sure that we're here, the next time a woman like Aisha needs help. So that's when you do that logic piece. And then you end with your ask. You're the hardest ask of the piece, asking people, will you make a gift today? And then don't forget, you've got a PS. The PS is often the first thing that the person reads, and sometimes it's the only thing they read from you. So it really is a short tease of what the story is going to be about, and then how you as the donor make a difference when you donate. So don't forget the PS. So that's, how I often write appeals. A very different structure, right? As I mentioned, there's multiple asks. In this piece where I was talking about, this is another piece about trees. You can see that there are actually 6 asks in the piece, and they go throughout the letter. So don't be afraid to ask, and don't wait until the bottom of the letter to ask. But you want to vary those asks, so they start out soft as thank yous, and because of you, these things happen, and then become, will you make that critical gift today? So, my final point is that complexity kills. So this, I've had the good fortune to be able to travel all over the world, teaching communications and teaching marketing to nonprofits. And I know the most important thing about that is to bring myself, not to bring a lot of stuff. And so seasoned travelers pack light. And right about when COVID hit, I was supposed to take my mother and my 12-year-old nephew, who's a little naughty, to Hawaii for 2 weeks. And this was the packing list that I gave my sister-in-law and my nephew. This is all I asked him to take for a 2-week trip. Because we were going to do laundry in the middle, and I didn't want him having to schlep things on those little tiny puddle jumper planes. And it's a lot like writing. The more that you try to pack into your story or to your appeal, the less impactful it becomes. One of the great writer, axioms is show, don't tell. If you find yourself writing more than 2 sentences about anything, you're starting to tell more than you're showing. You want people to feel. You want people to imagine themselves in the story. You don't want to be so prescriptive in your description about all of your programs or every step that you've taken during COVID that you lose people, or every step that they have in terms of tax deductions and tax credits. You'll lose people. You'll lose their interest. Right now they say that people have a 7-second interest about that of a goldfish. So you really want to keep things vivid and emotional and draw people in and not get too bogged down with, dragging lots of baggage and having to explain to things. But this is a skill. So let's talk about how you would practice this. Showing, not telling. Not getting so complex that people don't understand the picture you're painting, right? They don't need to see every little dot that you've painted and every brushstroke. That's for your newsletter that's for your newsletter. It's not for a fundraising appeal where the main point is to make money, right? So in the chat, tell me, what would you do if someone said, we need to mention all of our programs in our fundraising appeal? Or we need to use our fundraising appeal as a year-end news update and tell them everything that we've done this year. That's going to make money. How would you respond? And these are things that I got told all the time at nonprofits. So let's practice how that we would respond to people. Sometimes it comes from boards, executive directors sometimes, if they're not writing the appeals themselves. Or maybe we've missed a newsletter, or we've missed a few appeals because we've been so busy. And so we're trying to have this be one ring to rule them all. We want this to be a multi-purpose piece instead of a money-making piece to sustain our organization. So how would you respond? What is the diplomatic way to tell people we're not going to do that? Maybe it's yes, and we could do something else.
I think we have a shy-ish audience.
Oh, Marie's popping up. Less is more because it is clearer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think especially in the Western context, we have a preference for minimalism in design, and that something can be more beautiful if there is less of it. If you think so maybe giving people a metaphor and thinking about how we feel so good when we see, people feel so good when they see Crate and Barrel or IKEA, right? Because it's not super floofy Louis XVI furniture. It's clear and straightforward, and it's about emotion and asking for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when Anjali has a great suggestion.
Anjali's back. Hey, Anjali. Samples of successful appeals. One program, one story. Yeah, if they want to represent all their programs, that's great for a newsletter. You might be able to do that. Yeah, I know you've been here. You might be able to do it in your email appeals. So your print appeal has one great story, one great emotion, one great ask based on your donor's individual giving history is best. Do the data recording for that. And maybe the compromise you make with people is, well, great, I've got to write 3 or 4 emails, so maybe we can talk about some of those other things in emails. Get me a story I can work with for that. So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
Put that in the newsletter. Yeah.
Something that I always go back to is, what is the goal of this particular piece? Because you've got the larger communications with your donors, and not every piece is a ask every single time.
Ask, thank, report.
Repeat. Right?
Ask, thank, report, repeat. Yeah.
So can we use that particular story or program in another piece, like Laura said? And but this appeal is our goal to make $10,000. Okay, then this is the way that we're going to do it. This is the scientific way to pull that off. And different types of print pieces or communications have different goals, right? Your newsletter is not a hard ask. It's reporting and thanking people, and that's a really great place. With a yes, you always ask, right? But it's a softer ask.
So the person who's probably suggesting that you put pack all of these things into your appeal probably doesn't actually know much about response rates. Mm-hmm. So we know industry benchmarks, right? A printed year-end appeal generally has somewhere between, on average, about a 5 to 6% response rate. Right? It can be much, much higher if your donor data is well maintained. Mm-hmm. We know email has a 0.06% response rate. So less, it doesn't cost you anything, but it is less effective in bringing in money on that regard. That's why you got to send so many emails versus sending one printed appeal. And then we know that social media advertising generally loses about 3 cents for every dollar you invest in it. But it doesn't cost you anything to post on Facebook, although we know that, less than 1% of the people that we have as friends on Facebook don't actually see our posts. But the people who are asking you to do this probably don't know that. So you can say, hey, we'll dedicate an entire week to that program on social media. That might be a good compromise. But good. We are almost wrapping up here. So remember, a good appeal needs to connect emotionally to donors. It needs to tell a complete story, beginning, middle, and end, of transformation, not just we gave somebody a service, not a transaction. And it needs to be grateful and a repeated ask for support to do more good. That makes the donor the hero of the story, not your organization. So, we looked at the calendar. We've got a few weeks here to fall appeals, a couple months to your Thanksgiving appeal, and then maybe about 3 or 4 months to holiday. So if along the way you need help with your storytelling, whether it's for fundraising appeals or whether it is in things like newsletters or emails, definitely shoot us a note. And of course, putting out donation letters can be really time consuming to do in-house. Brianna and I have been part of the Stuff, Lick, and Stamp crew in the past. Hey, wait, why do we have one left over? If you don't want to do that this year, if your time is more valuable and you'd like to spend it doing some of those other thank and report pieces, calling your major donors, reporting back to them about how amazing and what they've done this year, and you want to leave the asking to us, we would be happy to write your appeal, do all of the data to make sure that people get personalized asks that fit the way that they want to give, do all of your list prep to make sure you don't have duplicates, and then make sure you print and mail at the most efficient cost, both in time and money to you. So if you want, we're happy to do that for you and deal with the printer of your choice. Just let us know. And of course, we have nonprofit pricing. We are not priced for a corporate communications team. We're priced for nonprofits because we came out of the nonprofit world and we want you to make more money this year to make more change happen in our world. So we all need that this year specifically. So, and that's all we have.
Thank you, Laura, for a inspiring session. I always learn something new, and we're yin and yang. I'm data and bigger picture stuff, and Laura gets into the letters. So I always learn something. If you want to stay and ask questions, we'll keep the session open for a few more minutes. You're more than welcome to stay. We're going to send you the materials via email, and in a few days we'll have the recorded session up and share that with you too. So thank you so much for your time, everyone, and go have a successful, giving season.
We want to hear about your happily ever after. So write your happily ever after for 2020, and I hope that this workshop helps everyone.
Yeah.
And thanks for letting me tell stories to you today.
Okay, Debbie has a question. Should stories always be based in fact, or is hypothetical okay?
So 99% of the time, I think they need to be real stories. Often we've used real stories that have anonymous names. The Aisha story, that's not her real name. But it was a name that sort of represented the multi-ethnic population that they serve. I have seen in very rare cases people write a story that is an amalgam of a couple different stories. I think that takes a lot of skill. And the problem is it leaves you without a photo. And photos are that non-word part of your communications. I think you've got to write it carefully, because a fake story can quickly erode credibility for your organization. So tread lightly. I have seen an amalgam story that represents what people often, because you hear the same kind of story over and over probably in your organization. I've seen it work. I think it treads on ethics, credibility issues. And you have to use a stock photo to draw people in. I've seen it done. I don't do it often. And I would only do it if you couldn't spend a little bit of time here trying to find a real story. Was that hopefully a good answer, or hopefully the right answer to your question? It's risky. It's risky.
Yeah.
And you might just say across the board, this story, I might even say in the appeal, this story, represents the kind of thing that we see every day with women in our shelter, or with this is a common story, and we've helped thousands of people like this, like Aisha, or like.
Yeah. And though stock photography is not the best, you can still use it, especially if you're working with a extremely risky population, right? Like my
we had two of those this spring.
Yeah, my husband used to work with refugee children, and they were not allowed to take photographs of the kids at all, because there, could be someone looking for them. But that organization fundraised based on generic stock photography of, people like this. But they did tell the anonymized stories of individual children.
Sometimes people are interested in using a story like that because they've run out of time, or they don't have a story gathering mechanism within their organization. Often with your program folks, they don't give you a real story. They give you more like the Luis story that was straight out of a program report. And you need to ask questions and suss out, what the story is. The best stories we write are ones where I actually get to talk to the real subject of the story. The second best is where I talk to a program person, usually several times, to get those details out. Oh, they're an Army veteran. Oh, and I ask very pointed questions to get those. So I think stories there have to be some follow-on conversations to suss them out. We can share, I often have a form that program people fill out to get to those elements of the 7 basic elements, that treasure map. You can use that as a guide to write a form. And at least you'll get a sense of what the story is, but you're going to need a week to get in there and suss those stories out to get to a really great, compelling story that's about the heart.
Yeah. And Debbie, you're saying that you're thinking about a what if story, and knowing you work for an art center, I would say we are in the what if story right now. What if there was no theater? I'm a theater kid. I haven't been on stage for 100 some days, and it's hurting my soul, right? Like, you can talk to some people who are engaged in your programs and be like, this isn't a physical problem, but we're seeing a lot of mental health issues and just the lack of joy, you know. So you can tell a story
Yeah.
from a perspective of an artist or even a patron of the arts that doesn't get to go, you know, see theater to make, you know, art makes you feel, right? To see those paintings in real life. Let's get to Anjali. She asks, does your story have to always be related to the program project you are trying to raise funds for? I know that mail appeals typically are for unrestricted funds, but can you use an impact story to build support for another project?
Absolutely.
I would say absolutely.
We're raising money right now for computers for people who are unable to take part, for people who are blind. They're at home, they've got other health conditions, so they can't go to the Center for the Blind. And they're raising money for computers so that those people can interact online and help with some of those mental health issues. And I think it's doing really well. So yeah, you can use it for that. People are often, it's pretty easy to raise money for something very specific and tangible like that, versus something, you know, those unrestricted funds that keep the lights on at our organization. So that's why you hear that quite often. I do want to caution Debbie. There are lots of, imagine yourself, and what if there were a world without arts? I think it can work, but I think a lot of people might go there this year, and that story is inherently negative. Whereas I'm putting up on our Facebook page lots of arts organizations that are finding a way to help people transcend what they're feeling. You know, art is about, you know, expressing our frustrations, but also finding a way to rise above that. You know, that's something that, you know, humans are able to do through art that other creatures aren't. So I think there's a lot of positive things where the arts are, you know, helping people who are depressed, or the arts are helping people remember what matters in life. You know, connect to that spiritual part of their life. You know, the part of the soul that yearns to be, you know, to connect with others. You know.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point.
Yeah, because you're not really competing with others in the fundraising space. I know it often feels like that, but other people don't have your database. Getting back to data. So you're really just trying to remind donors of why they love you. And what they're doing through you to change lives, you know, to make people feel better, feel something. And the arts do that. So I just put up a piece about the Vancouver Choral Society that are doing COVID-19 mask awareness videos. And I so appreciate that.
Or British Columbia?
Vancouver.
There are two.
Vancouver Choir,
British Columbia or Washington.
Oh, sorry. Midwesterner.
That's me showing my Northwest colors.
they just did. You know, they made people happy with their music, and people desperately need that. They did. Mama just killed a man.
Bohemian
Didn't
Rhapsody.
Wear a mask outside. And then they did Billy Joel's For the Longest Time. I have been inside for the longest time. So there's inherently joy to that. And going into the holiday season, we all associate that with music. We all associate that with being at Swan Lake or going to Handel's Messiah. And, you know, how can we capture that in our own hearts? How can we share that with others, you know, in this time? So that joy. I would write a piece about joy and the arts.
Great.
Zig when everybody else zags, I think is what you want to do.
Yeah. Well, lovely. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions to handle. Thank you, Debbie and Tamara, or Tamara, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, for sticking around till the very end, and have a lovely day.